Thank you. Mr. Green?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I thank the ranking member as well. I thank the witnesses for appearing, and I'd like for you this morning to help me with a dilemma. We use the term small bank and community bank quite often interchangeably, and I'm trying to get some sort of definition that I can work with for the term community bank. So please allow me to ask you a few questions, and I'll also take a stab at your name, Ms. Bartolomucci.
Yes.
And Mr. Richards. Would you agree that a bank that has assets of $100 million, that this is a small bank, $100 million?
Quite small. Yes, quite small.
Quite small. Would you concur, ma'am?
For credit unions, I would say, Representative, for a small credit union would be $50 million and under.
Well, for our purposes, for this moment in time, if we may, let's stick to banks just for the moment. Okay. And this may be beyond what you would call your level of expertise, but I'm interested in your opinion. Would that be a small bank, $100 million?
I would say so, yes.
Would you agree that a $100 billion bank is a large bank?
Yes.
Ma'am?
Yes.
So somewhere in between 100 million and 100 billion, would you agree that 100 billion is a large bank and is not a community bank? Let me ask this before I go on. 100 billion is not a community bank.
I wouldn't want to say that the definition of a community bank is necessarily based on asset size.
I understand, but we'll deal with asset size for the moment. Would a $100 billion bank be a community bank?
I would say most likely not, but I wouldn't want to say definitively no.
All right. And ma'am, would you agree that a $100 billion bank is not a community bank?
Representative, I don't believe I have the expertise in the banking area to answer that question.
I understand. And this is the dilemma that we have, because we start out talking about doing things for small banks and community banks, but when we end up looking at what we will actually accomplish, the rules then move to $100 billion banks. And I am a strong supporter of what I believe to be a community bank and a small bank. And I'd like to see some regulations softened for small banks and community banks. I've talked to enough of these bankers to understand that they do have some legitimate concerns about regulations and the regulatory burdens that they have to adhere to. But when we try to craft rules, we find ourselves moving from small community banks to positions where folk are reluctant to say that a $100 billion bank is not a community bank. So if a $100 billion bank is a community bank, how do we craft the rules to impact the banks that I think you really want to see impacted? Do you follow where I'm going, Mr. Richards?
Yes, I do follow where you're going. Yes, sir.
Yeah, so at some point, we do have to make some decisions about whether a $100 billion bank is going to be a community bank. Now, if you think a $100 billion bank is a community bank, you will make it very difficult for me to support the rule that will impact community banks, because we're talking about pretty much all banks. So how do we get to this point of demarcation wherein we understand the legitimate difference between big banks and small banks and community banks?
I think a major difference between what you might call a mega bank or your kind of Walmart of banks and a true community bank is the fact that community banks really do tailor their products and services to their customers.
Well, if we accept that as a definition, we can accept any bank as a community bank. All banks can be community banks. And maybe that's the world we're in, where all banks are community banks. But when we talk about these things in terms of making rules to soften the regulations, we conjure up in our minds the image of an institution that's smaller. But if we're going to do this for all banks, if all banks are community banks, because of size doesn't matter, then we probably are going to have to start to talk about small banks as opposed to community banks, because it looks like the term community bank, based upon most of what I'm hearing, applies to all banks. I'll have to yield back because I'm over. Thank you, Madam Chair.